The prosecution claimed Ms O'Hara's psychiatric difficulties made her a more attractive victim, as her death would be more easily put down to suicide. It boiled down to what happened after Elaine O'Hara crossed the railway bridge at Shangana Park on August the 22nd, 2012.
This case has some of the most incredible detective work that I've ever seen in an investigation. I don't know if this is wildly different to every single case I've covered. It could very well just be because I had access to the most detailed and specific book, and I will leave a link down below. It's called Almost the Perfect Murder, and it's by Paul Williams. Thank you, Jane, for the recommendation and for sending me the book. It has been about 2 years since you sent it to me, but I'm finally here. I got round to it. It's going to be detailed. It's going to be long. So strap in and get ready for another horrific story. This case truly is the most impressive investigation I've ever researched. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. This show is made from various source documents listed in the show notes. I use news archives, documentary footage and court documents, and so the episodes are accurate to the source material I can find. You can find each episode as a podcast version available in the description box down below. Elaine O'Hara was born in 1976 to Frank and Eileen O'Hara, and her childhood wasn't smooth or easy by any means. She was bullied at school, and when she was just 15 years old, she lost a close friend in a car accident. These events, as well as some psychiatric challenges, meant that Elaine had become depressed, and alongside this, she also suffered from anxiety. To deal with this and to cope, she began smoking heavily, which did not help her asthma problems. And she wasn't the most articulate speaker because of her dyslexia. Because of all of these things, she had extremely low self-esteem. By the time she was 16, Elaine had already attempted to take her own life, and it was a constant worry for her parents. They wanted to get her the help and support she'd so desperately needed, and so they decided to bring her to a mental health facility, where she was given a number of different medications, and she stayed on those for the following few years. And then, tragically, in 2002, Elaine's mum passed away, and she really struggled with this loss. Her mum had been such a huge support when dealing with her mental health challenges, and unfortunately, this set Elaine back in terms of her progress. By the time she was 30 years old, she'd attempted to take her life a further 2 times. Elaine's daily life was always pretty similar. She was a creature of habit, and she worked at a newsagent's part-time. It was scary for her to reach out of her normal, but she surprised everyone when she decided to volunteer at the Tall Ships Festival in Dublin city centre. She decided that she was going to do it, and the upcoming 2 days had been in her diary for months. She'd attended a training day ahead of starting there, and the day before she was due to begin volunteering, she had a pretty normal day. By all accounts, she was excited for the upcoming volunteer days. Elaine had been staying at a mental health facility where she'd been discharged after a successful stay. By the time she left, she was noticeably happier and in good spirits, and in fact, people that saw her once she had returned had even commented on just how positive she seemed to be. After returning home, she'd gone to the pharmacy, she got her prescriptions, and she even spoke with a pharmacist about popping back in once she'd been paid so she could settle this bill. It was €132 for that medication. After that, she called in to see her dad, and then the pair set off to the nearby graveyard, and they placed some flowers on her mum's grave. On the way to the graveyard, Frank was driving, her dad Frank was driving, and Elaine was sat in the passenger seat, and she was on her phone for pretty much the whole journey, to the point where Frank suggested that she put her phone away for a bit, and she agreed, and so she did. They visited the grave, they laid flowers, and then they later returned home to Frank's house to eat ice cream with Elaine's niece. And then at 4 p.m, Elaine told her dad that she was going to go home and get an early night before her early start the next day at the Tall Ships Festival. Later that evening, Frank's partner, Sheila, had texted Elaine, quote, "See you tomorrow 7:15 a.m. But when the morning came and there was no sign of her, Sheila headed round to Elaine's apartment. She knocked at the door, there was no answer, and she wasn't answering her phone either. Sheila called Elaine's dad, Frank, to let him know what was going on, and he said that he wasn't worried, but he would come round, he'd use his spare key and he'd go inside. But when he opened the door, he was surprised to see that not only was Elaine nowhere to be found, but her iPhone, which she took everywhere with her, was also plugged in and charging. This was concerning for Frank, but he figured she'd probably just left in a hurry and she'd be back home soon and come and collect her phone after she'd finished that day's volunteering. He had texted her in the meantime, quote, "Are you alive?" And he waited and waited. But then the following morning, with still no sign of Elaine and her phone still being at the apartment charging, clearly she'd not been back home, Frank decided to start calling round to find out where she might be. His first point of call was to call the local mental health facility that Elaine had just been at a couple of days earlier, but they informed Frank they hadn't seen her. And so then his next port of call was to call the festival organisers, but again, they hadn't seen her. Now, the fact she hadn't turned up to the festival was extremely worrying. She'd been in really good spirits. She was extremely excited about going there. Her not showing up meant that something was seriously wrong. Frank tended to speak to his daughter on the phone every single day, and with her not having been in touch at all, he decided he had no choice but to report her as missing. It was clear that this was extremely out of character for Elaine, and given her mental health challenges, she was considered a vulnerable person, and so an investigation was immediately launched into Elaine's disappearance. And at the same time as that was happening, Elaine's family and friends continued to search for her. Elaine's brother John went to the graveyard to see if there was any sign of Elaine, and although he couldn't find her, he did find her car. He peered inside and he could see that she had left behind a driving licence, her phone charger, and when he looked more closely at that phone charger, he realised that it wasn't for an iPhone, it was for a different kind of phone, and as far as he was aware, and all of her family were aware, she didn't own another phone. The Garda helicopter was sent over the graveyard and to the nearby cliff edge and ongoing sea, and using its heat-seeking cameras to search, it continued like this for hours, but even after 2 days of searching, there was no real progress in terms of finding where Elaine was at. The Garda trawled through CCTV from the last time Elaine had been seen, and the footage showed her going into her apartment alone at 4:29 p.m, and this, of course, checked out with what time she'd left her dad's house. It showed her leaving again at 5:02 p.m, she returns a few seconds later and then leaves again for good at 5:05 p.m. The last sighting of Elaine's car was 7 minutes later, just about 1 kilometre away from the apartment. And that's footage shows her turning onto a road and continuing forward, but then they lose her. The next time that car was seen was, of course, by Elaine's brother outside of that graveyard. Curiously, the CCTV footage showed that Elaine did have a phone in her hand, but we know that her iPhone was found at her apartment. The phone in her hand wasn't one anyone who recognised her knew about, and this in itself was extremely suspicious. The investigating team knew they needed to find that phone. As the search continued, the Garda spoke to a number of witnesses, and one was a man who said that he had seen a woman matching Elaine's description on the night she disappeared. This man, Connor, had seen Elaine at about 6:15 p.m, and the reason he remembered this was because she appeared to be lost, and she'd even asked him, quote, "Is there a railway bridge near here?" And Connor pointed her in the direction of the bridge, but he mentioned to officers how distant and vacant she seemed. Other than that, the investigating team really had no other sightings or information known about Elaine's last movements. It looked like that sighting was the last sighting of Elaine O'Hara. They did, however, manage to find a number of items during their search of Elaine's apartment that would eventually help solve the mysterious disappearance. During the search of the apartment, they found the following: 2 heavy metal chains in a bedside locker, more chains, some locks, a PVC dress, a rope, a gas mask, prescription drugs, black latex bodysuit, printed pictures of hunting knives, and Google Maps of Killer Key Woods. They also found a notebook with the website www.fetlife.com that had been written in it, and it was found to be a fetish lifestyle site for people interested in BDSM. Despite the reams of potential evidence found, the fact that Elaine had just been released from a mental health facility and the fact that she'd been hospitalised a total of 14 times for mental health challenges, she also had a history of self-harm and had attempted to take her life 3 times. This was concerning for officers. The fact she'd also parked her car at her late mother's grave before disappearing, for them, it all pointed towards Elaine potentially having taken her own life. And so Elaine's case was closed. The Garda dismissed it as most likely Elaine having taken her own life, and that was that. But all of that changed one day in September of 2013. 3 fishers were out at Vartry Reservoir when they came across a number of curious items, including what looked like a nose ring for a bull, a set of handcuffs, a blindfold, a bondage collar, and leg shackles. One of the fishers decided to take these items to Roundwood Garda Station, and an officer met him there, took the items to bag and label them, and then decided to head out himself to the area they'd been found to see if he could find anything of note. I already think this is pretty good police work. The fact that this officer has been given these items that could mean nothing. There's no link to Elaine or anything bad happening as of yet, but he has a feeling that something's wrong and he wants to investigate further, and so he takes himself up there to see what he can find. While he was there, he found even more items, including some keys with a Dunn's store fob card, a leather mask, and an inhaler. And so when he arrived back at the station, he called that Dunn's store to try and get any kind of information about who the keys belonged to. And that was when he was given the name Elaine O'Hara. Meanwhile, not too far away, a dog walker was out on her usual forest walk with her dogs when she came across a number of bones. At first, she thought these bones might belong to an animal. There was a rib cage, and she assumed that it was probably something like a deer, a larger kind of animal. But as she continued further forward, she came across a chilling discovery. Attached to one of the bones was a pair of blue tracksuit bottoms and a boot. She called emergency services, and when the Garda arrived, they also found a rusty knife blade near to where the bones were, as well as a jawbone. There was also a significant amount of white substance, which was later identified as adipocere, I want to say. That may be the wrong pronunciation. It's a liquid that is formed over a period of time when water meets body fat. And the post-mortem would eventually come back to show that the cause of death was listed as undetermined because of the level of decomposition. They just couldn't tell. They were able, however, to get a few details, including that the remains belonged to a female, that she was somewhere between 27 to 40 years old, and that she had died between 1 and 2 years ago. They finally managed to compare that jawbone that they found with the dental records of all missing persons on the database, and that's when they found that there was a match, and unsurprising to us, it matched Elaine O'Hara. The investigation was now back in full force, and both the forest where Elaine's remains were found and the reservoir where her belongings were found, or these questionable belongings, they were both cordoned off as crime scenes. In the reservoir, a number of items were recovered. There were 2 Nokia 1616 mobile phones. There were another 2 knives. There were various sex toys, a leather collar, a sawn-off barrel of a shotgun, a computer desktop, a large lens camera, and a dressing gown with a Real Madrid crest on it. They were all found in that same reservoir. And through researching this case, I found that not all of those items are relevant to Elaine, although a lot of them are. But it seems that this area in particular may well have been known as a spot for gangs to dump things that they wanted to get rid of, or anyone really. If you wanted to get rid of something, you could come here. And we'll get into the specifics of exactly what was found and how that relates a little bit later. Alongside this, as the investigation is going on, the team had returned to Elaine's apartment to properly cordon it off as a crime scene and search through it a lot more thoroughly. Detectives found that there were puncture marks and bloodstains on the mattress, and so that was taken in for forensic testing. Through the questioning of Elaine's family and through the questioning of her therapist, they found out that she'd become involved with a man who was married and had a child. She'd met him as part of the BDSM community. This man would often cut her, and he would use a small knife to stab her. This relationship they had was very on and off, and one of the statements that she had made to her dad was that she had asked this man to kill her, but he'd refused. And within this, she also mentions that he's from Fox Rock. At the time, her dad didn't necessarily think that she was saying anything that was true, and perhaps she was just saying it to shock him. She had had these kind of outbursts in the past, and so he didn't think too much of it. We know now that this was true, and this relationship being on and off again eventually had started up again, and Elaine had drafted emails that spoke of ending things, but she never actually sent those emails. Police would just find them in her drafts. Through the investigation, one of Elaine's friends, who was an inpatient at one time at the same mental health facility as her, told investigating officers that she had some information on this married man and they might find it useful. Quote, "He was an architect and he was married, and it was a properly physical relationship in which he would inflict pain on her by cutting her." Obviously, this was of significant relevance because of the items that had been found in the reservoir. They needed to identify who this man was as soon as possible. And it quickly became clear that this man wasn't necessarily a secret. A nurse that had worked with Elaine spoke about how she had once been pissed off with this man because he was constantly trying to get her to take part in bondage games. And this nurse added that that man had a key that could access Elaine's apartment. And she got the feeling that Elaine was scared of him. She also had wanted to steer clear of him because she knew he obviously had children. And in general, she loved children. She didn't want them to get hurt because of this man's actions. And so she had tried to cut it off for this reason, amongst many others. It was clear by this point of the investigation that Elaine had likely been brought to where she died with the sole intention of being killed and buried out there. The Garda thought this was premeditated. More CCTV footage from outside Elaine's apartment was gathered and checked, but this time they wanted to review it all. They knew that it was likely Elaine knew her killer, and equally as likely that he had free access to her apartment, and so he'd probably been there numerous times before her death. The team were reviewing a lot of footage. In total, it was over 5,000 hours of footage. It took a long time. But whilst reviewing this footage, there was something that stuck out. The footage was from June 2012, and firstly, Elaine had gotten home to the building at 6:54 p.m. and went into the lift. And then at 7:04 p.m, a man enters the apartment block. And this man enters and presses the call button for the lift. But the reason that this sort of stuck out was because of this man's body language. He was very clearly attempting to face away from the cameras and facing away from the lift itself. It was completely abnormal behaviour. He was in this apartment block for a little over an hour before CCTV then tracks him leaving again. Meanwhile, back in the investigation headquarters, forensic technicians had managed to download data from Elaine's iPhone, the one that was recovered from her apartment. And some of the text messages were explicit, specifically speaking about BDSM and S&M practices. including calling one person Sir. They found 8 men that Elaine had spoken to through this website and 2 that she'd actually met. Now, both of those 2 men did have alibis from the night she disappeared, and so they were pretty immediately eliminated from the investigation. They did, however, find a huge number of messages between Elaine and a number under the saved name David. Many of the messages were graphic and explicit in their nature. This David person was expressing his desire to be violent towards Elaine. And just before I get into the details of this, I want to clarify that I am not kink shaming. I really do think whatever floats your boat, you do you. But I also strongly believe that it has to be from a place of mutual respect and it has to be consensual. And this is very clearly not that. One set of messages showed that they had stopped speaking for a while, but now David was back in touch. Quote, David, what time suits? Elaine, I'm working till 2:30. I don't live where I used to, so where? David, 3 then. I've been watching your old place, figured you moved. Do you still smoke? Still have dark thoughts? Your place? The messages that I could find in the book and online are pretty disturbing, if I'm honest. There are a number that talk about a kind of assisted suicide, but a kind where it is blatantly clear that David is getting off on this and Elaine is not into it. And on top of this, he's pretty horrible to her generally. Some of this, I think, is down to the kind of relationship that they had in this BDSM world, but a lot of it is just him telling her that she's not good enough and that no one's ever going to love her. It's pretty horrific. A number of exchanges spoke of her wanting a child and asking if David would ever give her one. David does agree, kind of, but he has one condition: a life for a life. He would only help her if she would help him by taking a life, by stabbing a, quote, girl to death. Then he'd give her a baby. Quote, David, help me satisfying my stabbing fetish. Find me someone or some way of doing it, or offer your own flesh. Elaine, to kill, sir, or just stab? David, if it's you, just stab unless you want to die. If it's a stranger, then she has to die so she can't identify me. Later, Elaine asked if he would mind if she, quote, played with someone else. David said that's fine, as long as she wears a condom, and that he doesn't have to because he always pulls out. This guy. He then says that more male DNA, the better, adding that he wants the man's prints on Elaine's kitchen knife. But Elaine responds that this new guy isn't into anything like that. He's much more, in her words, gentle, which for some reason prompts David to say that if the man gives her any trouble, then they can always just kill him. David is utterly obsessed with rape and murder. He speaks about them often, and he even later texted Elaine saying that there had been a woman stabbed in Dublin, but she was still alive. He added that the man got away, but it was a big mistake leaving a witness. Elaine is constantly telling David she doesn't like this. She doesn't want him to kill, and although she has some BDSM and S&M preferences, she is clear that she thinks he is sick, and she tells him this. Another exchanges of messages are David speaking about having found a target. He told Elaine that he was walking one day when he saw a female estate agent and that they could kill her. They would need to plan it, he said, starting by getting Elaine a new phone, a new untraceable phone, and then getting her to call the office and make an appointment to view a property. He added that they'd make false names and say that they were both teachers. They also needed to check the escape routes. They needed to make sure that there weren't any cameras. And then he goes on to describe exactly how they'll do it. Quote, then go back to yours and celebrate. Knock you up, Elaine. This man, he knows that Elaine wants a child more than anything. He knows that she is one of the most vulnerable and struggling people that is why he chose her. But also, he is determined to make what he wants happen with no regard for any other human life. What he doesn't know is just how much Elaine will resist him. She is clearly extremely uncomfortable with what he's saying, and she's continuously telling him he could and would get caught. Forensic analysis of the phone records, specifically the violently descriptive messages that had been sent to Elaine, showed that it was possible to track the phone's location and come up with a list of dates, times and places that the suspect had been. Once they discovered who the man was, this would be crucial evidence in taking the case through to conviction. They had identified through this that the man was most active in central Dublin and Cornell's Court Village in South Dublin. The investigating team got an incredibly important lead within some of these analysed messages from David to Elaine. In one exchange, David had mentioned that he'd been flying, and this led the team to thinking that he must have some kind of flying experience. At first, they thought perhaps he's able to operate a small aircraft, or that he was able to fly model aircrafts and that flying was a common thing for him to do. They were helped out again when they found an exchange where Elaine had asked David how his weekend was going, and he'd replied that he'd been flying in Wicklow and come in 5th place. On further investigation, the team managed to track down information on various pilot registers and flight competitions, but this didn't point to anyone specific. It did, however, help to narrow down the search. They then looked into a fun flight event, which was part of a model aircraft event, and they cross-checked the date in the messages alongside the information of the person who had ended up in 5th place. And that is when they found the name Graham Dwyer. The reason this is even more significant is because of one of Elaine's diary entries. It had a note of a phone number alongside the name Graham. Now, as well as that, she'd written Graham's name and phone number down, and that was in her telephone book. The detectives searched the Garda system for anyone matching the name Graham Dwyer, and they got a hit. Not that this Graham had a criminal record, but a former partner of his had reported an incident, and then they'd not gone on to press charges, but his name was noted down. Alongside this, they found that Graham had been put into the system as part of an investigation open into him having his bike stolen from outside of his work address. They looked at both his work and home address and saw that his home address was not far at all from where the phone tower signal had come from the burner phone and which one had been used the most. It wasn't hard for them to find Graham's work website and pull up a photo of him, and that's when they saw that Graham Dwyer very clearly matched the build and the overall look of the man they'd been tracking on CCTV footage from outside of Elaine's apartment. They also managed to find details of a child that he'd had with his wife back in March of 2011, and this detail matched some of the messages that were sent to Elaine, speaking about him just having had a baby with his wife. As a result of this, Graham was placed on round-the-clock surveillance, and the Garda actually tracked him. They needed to see what his usual movements and routines were, as well as keeping out an eye for anything suspicious or sort of out of the ordinary. Ultimately, they needed more time to build up their investigation, but they were worried that if Graham had any idea at all that they might be onto him, there was every chance that he would try and leave the country, and they just couldn't risk that. So he was on round-the-clock surveillance from that point on. The next part of this story is truly incredible investigating. A police and crime analyst had been looking into the mobile phone positioning of the number they had for what was saved as MSTR, or Master. They managed to track it moving through 2 toll booths, and then they cross-checked that with the registration plates that were registered to any South Dublin address. I guess because the 2 toll booths were specific and far away enough from each other that they didn't get a load of hits. In fact, they only got one, and it was a blue Audi TT with a license plate that was registered to Graham Dwyer. The same analyst managed to get tracking data from Graham's work phones and found that they had made the exact same journeys as the master's phone on multiple occasions, including once travelling to Graham's parents' house. As part of the investigation, they were able to analyse the 2 Nokia phones recovered from the reservoir, despite them being completely submerged in water and mud. It revealed that on the day Elaine disappeared, she'd saved the master number, but onto her personal iPhone. And this was saved under the name David 2. The Nokia phone belonging to Elaine, the one that her family didn't know she had only one number saved. And that was traced back to a shop that it had been bought at, and it was found that it was bought at the same time as the other Nokia phone. So these 2 Nokia phones were found in the reservoir. They were bought at the exact same time. One definitely belonged to Elaine, and one they didn't know who it belonged to. Detectives theorised that Graham had bought these 2 phones as part of this plot to murder Elaine. This strongly added to the premeditation evidence that they'd begun to gather. Phone records from both Nokia phones found in the reservoir showed that in the days leading up to the murder, the pair exchanged some very telling messages. There's a lot of back and forth about exactly what Graham wants to do and is going to do to Elaine. And from Elaine's side, there's a lot of asking for specific things like no physical marks, or even at points asking if they can stop talking about it because it is scaring her. After that, it's clear Elaine and Graham have arranged to meet the moment she is discharged from the mental health facility. But Elaine reminds him that she is volunteering at the Tall Trees Festival the following 2 days, and so she doesn't want to, quote, be sore, and she asks if it's going to be that bad. He then goes on to give her direct and specific instructions on what he wants her to do, both in preparation for their meeting as well as exactly where to meet. Quote, I want you to park at Shang'ana Cemetery at 5:30. Leave your phone at home, just bring slave phone and keys. You will get further instructions there. Elaine asks if they're still going to do it if it's raining, and Graham responds that yes, they are. She then asks, quote, no offence, sir, but do we have to do it in rain? It's cold. Unsurprisingly, Graham says, yes, we do, quote. And then he tells her to, quote, just empty yourself and become nothing. Over the next half an hour, Graham turned off his work phone, but he continued to message Elaine on the burner phones. And the messages between the two of them are pretty much Graham directing Elaine on where to go and how to get there, including crossing a railway bridge, which for us goes back to that witness account where Elaine had asked for directions to the railway bridge. He then directs her to go down the steps and wait, and that's when both phones are switched off. And the investigation team theorised that this is what happened next. Once Elaine was down those steps on the shore side, Graham would have been waiting in his car, and after making sure that there was no one else around that could identify either of them or his vehicle, he made his way to Elaine. He brought her back, got her inside his car, and then the pair drove towards the forest where Elaine's remains were eventually found. He had already prepared for the journey by mapping it out, making sure that no one would be able to see them through the CCTV, and that the route he chose was not frequented by other drivers very often. Once they arrived at the forest, Graham acted out his plan. It's not exactly clear how many times he stabbed Elaine or how long for, but we know that Graham was back at his house by around 9 p.m. and his work phone was turned back on. He was tracked to nearby his home address at that time. So with the time after that last text message was sent, before the phones were switched off, and the journey time back to Graham's house, the whole ordeal probably lasted just under an hour. On the 17th of October, the team approached Graham's house at 7 a.m. to arrest him. They had the evidence they needed. But They did not know what to expect in terms of Graham's level of resistance, and so they equipped themselves with a lot of officers surrounding the house, as well as some standing by, ready to interview potential witnesses that they'd not yet spoken to. In fact, they'd waited to speak to a number of people because they didn't want Graham to be tipped off in any way. They also brought a towing vehicle to take Graham's car. Now, when Graham answered the door, he certainly seemed confused, especially when he was told he was being arrested on suspicion of Elaine's murder. Graham's wife was at the house. Her name is Gemma, and she came to the door to ask what was going on. And that's when she was given the search warrant and told that the house was going to be searched and her husband was going to be coming down to the station. They also had a warrant to search Graham's offices, and they managed to retrieve a number of items: laptops, memory sticks, computers, and various documents. And all of these were then sent on for further technical forensic analysis. In the interview room, Graham was outright asked if he killed Elaine O'Hara, to which, unsurprisingly, he answered no, he hadn't killed anyone. But he had heard of the murder, he said, and the subsequent investigation. He'd heard of it through newspapers and online. When probed as to exactly what he'd heard or seen, he told them that he remembered they'd found some of her belongings and the general area that her body had been found, but he couldn't really remember any specifics. He may have read about it, but he wouldn't retain it, is what he said. Within the first little while of the interrogation, the questions were seemingly completely unrelated to the murder and probably came across to Graham as just icebreakers, normal, unimportant conversation. But within this, they managed to get a few pieces of information out of Graham. He said he would sometimes visit his sister, and he gave them the address as somewhere in Tipperary, quote, Oak something Clerihan. What he didn't know, or at the very least had forgotten, was that the burner phone that had been found alongside the other items in the reservoir, that was purchased under the fake name David, and it was registered to the address Oak Lawn, Clerihan, Tipperary. Idiot. They also asked what hobbies he had, and he outright told them how much he liked to fly model aeroplanes. Throughout the so-called small talk, Graham seemed completely unbothered by these small facts, and he even offered up bits and pieces of information that, although wholly circumstantial, they would be important in adding small but significant links between himself and the murderer. He said that he often went out for walks at lunchtime on Grafton Street. That was the same street the burner phones had been bought from. He added that he had bought a bike under this sort of governmental tax incentive scheme. And we know that he had previously spoken to Elaine about having bought a bike so he could, quote, get fit for murder. This was in the text messages. As well as this, he admitted to knowing about and being in Stepaside, which is where Elaine had gone missing from. He admitted that he had been there at some point in the past. Graham, throughout the interview, was adamant that he had nothing to do with Elaine's murder, and in fact, he was pretty annoyed at the inconvenience of it. He was angry that his wife had been brought into the station and that he may have lost an architectural job because of the accusations. Quote, I would like you to know how my life has been ruined by this case. How can I help you? The detective sat across from Graham and presented him with various bits of evidence, but Graham simply responded to each one, denying his knowledge of it, not really giving anything, or saying that it didn't prove that he was a murderer. When presented with the burner phone registered address being where his sister lived, he simply said, quote, I don't know what to say to that. When presented with the hundreds of texts describing these violent and specific fantasies, and then asked specifically about BDSM and if he saw himself as a master, Graham replied, quote, this is the most private thing. I can't talk about it. Please respect that. I would be very uncomfortable. I would like to preserve my marriage. Thank you very much. The man thinks that he can just get the detective to stop asking questions, to let him off this line of inquiry, all because he's a bit uncomfortable with what he's being asked. he seems to forget that not only has he sent these messages, and that will be provable, but he also clearly forgets that he's the sole and key suspect in this murder investigation. I am sure Elaine was not comfortable when he was literally stabbing her to death, but he seems to have forgotten about that too and is wholly concerned with how uncomfortable he might be. The first real bit of talking that Graham did was when he was presented with evidence of the rucksack that was seen with him on CCTV and then later collected as evidence from the reservoir. He said that this rucksack wasn't his, but he did know who it belonged to. The rucksack was Elaine's. He said that he knew she kept BDSM gear in this rucksack, and after hours of denying he had any connection with Elaine, this is the point when he finally admits to knowing her. He said that the pair had met on a BDSM website a few years back, and they'd spoken numerous times over the years, but he adds that she was way more into this BDSM world than he was. Meanwhile, the technical forensic investigation of the hard drive that was discovered at the reservoir proved incredibly telling. They managed to recover files that had been deleted long ago, and on that hard drive, not only did they find snuff films and violent pictures, all featuring horrific things happening to women, but alongside those, they found many personal pictures and videos from Graham's life, including christenings and pregnancy scans and family photos, and even videos of Graham flying his model aeroplane. It was clear that this hard drive not only belonged to Graham, but also showed his interest in snuff films and BDSM and many other things. There were even videos of Graham himself having sex with various women, including Elaine. And in these videos, he is being horrifically violent, including using knives, plastic bags, cable ties. I'm not going to go into detail here. It is awful. And you can find it online or in the book if you really want to know. But forewarning, it is horrible. They also discovered a number of Word documents, and one of those was essentially a fantasy novel that Graham had penned one day in March 2011. It spoke in detail about wanting to find someone suicidal or terminally unwell and help them take their own life. In the novel, it talks about meeting a woman from Boston who he had spoken to about how they would end her life, and she being a willing participant. And he goes on to describe the act in detail and says that he's utterly in love with her. They also found many other short novels describing equally as brutal acts, and given Graham's experience and behaviour and the evidence gathered so far, the investigating team were genuinely worried that some of these fantasy novels may not be fantasy but real life instead. And so they sought to either prove or disprove these stories. And they soon got a lead for a woman in Boston. They managed to work with US authorities, and they tracked down this woman called Darcy Day from Maine. She told the Garda that she had been in contact with Graham way back in 2011, and that they'd met on this website dedicated to taking your own life. Graham had told her about his fantasies, and he'd even spoken specifically about Elaine and that he was going to kill her first. The investigating team had spoken to all of the people that they thought might be useful in terms of who knew Graham, and his ex-partner told the officers that Graham had shared a fantasy with her when they were together, and it was pretty worrying. One day, he had told her that he wanted to stab a woman while having sex. And after that, whenever they would have sex, Graham would bring a kitchen knife into the bedroom and he would just leave it on the floor. Now, as this continued over the following little while, Graham started actually holding that knife, and his ex-partner said that the only way he could achieve sexual gratification was by actually having and holding that knife during sex. The investigating team did manage to locate some knives that were in Graham's possession at his work offices. They found 3 knives altogether, and they believed that at least one of those could be the murder weapon, and so they were taken in for forensic analysis. There was obviously a boatload of evidence, and so the trial went ahead, and altogether the prosecution had access to this huge amount of evidence. In fact, there were almost 800 individual statements. There were more than 2,500 texts that had been examined, 5 terabytes of computer evidence, and there were 925 exhibits that were put into evidence altogether. The defence's angle was to lead with the fact that there had been no proven cause of death and the evidence collected was circumstantial. And they also focused on the fact that Elaine had been doing BDSM and that in their opinion she was a willing participant in this relationship. And there also was a distinct focus on Elaine's mental health history that ultimately was suggesting that she'd taken her own life after all. In the opening statements, however, the prosecution did outline the fact that although there wasn't any specific forensic evidence or witnesses that could link Graham to where Elaine's remains were eventually found, they did find, quote, remarkable coincidences that supported the prosecution's case that this was a simple and straightforward case of murder. Specifically, the evidence presented included all of the things we've spoken about so far: the model aeroplane texts, him coming in 5th place, Graham's semen being found on Elaine's mattress. That DNA was collected when at 5 a.m. one morning during the investigation. Graham hadn't been arrested yet, but they needed his DNA, and a number of items, including a turtle wax container, were recovered from outside of Graham's house in the bins, and that was compared to the semen DNA on the mattress and found to be a match. Other evidence includes the reams of text messages between the 2 phones and the location evidence that put Graham not only purchasing the phone at the same time, the 2 Nokia phones at the same time, but also carrying his burner phone with him on a daily basis. And finally, the CCTV evidence of Graham identified by himself, he said, "That is me," in a police interview, that puts him at Elaine's flat with the backpack that was eventually found in the reservoir with a boatload of evidence inside of it. Elaine's dad, Frank, his partner, Sheila, who just happened to be a psychologist, was called to the stand to testify. She said that Elaine seemed much younger than her years, and in fact, in her professional opinion, had the emotional maturity of a 15-year-old. Elaine's sister also testified, and she said that Elaine's psychological difficulties meant that she never really grew up as much as the rest of the children in the family. And she goes on to add that Elaine was naive and very, very trusting of people. Darcy Day, the woman from Boston whose Graham's graphic novel had been based on, was called to testify at trial. This woman has faced the most challenges. She was sexually abused as a child. She suffered from acute psychiatric difficulties. She'd been self-harming from the age of 12, and she was just in a very fragile and panicked state when it came to anything to do with Graham, quite understandably. In December of 2014, she actually contacted the Major Crimes Unit to report that something had happened. She had received a letter from Graham, sent from prison. This was extremely worrying to her because she'd only ever spoken to him over email. How he knew her home address was a complete mystery. And in this letter, Graham spoke specifically about how this case against him was bogus and how he would be getting out. And as far as Darcy was concerned, Graham would be released from prison following him being found innocent, and he may well come after her and pay her a visit. Darcy did end up testifying at trial via video link because remember she's in America, and she answered questions including confirming that Graham had mentioned Elaine O'Hara before, and she went on to describe what she understood as their relationship, which pretty much reflected what the prosecution had presented. And she added that Graham had told her his fantasy was to kill a woman during sex. She also spoke in detail about what he planned to do with her. Quote, that he would have me meet him somewhere, and then from there I would leave my car and get into the car with him, and he would drive me to the location, and then basically from there he wanted to have sex and then cut my throat until I lost consciousness during intercourse. The prosecution stated, quote, all the elements of the plan, isolation, carefully selected location checked before, the phones, it being made to look like a suicide, telling her that she'd be back and to think it was real, pretend it was real, and disposal of the evidence. Everything points to this careful, elaborate and thoughtful plan being implemented on the day. Ultimately, Graham was found guilty of murder and he was sentenced to life in prison.
Graham Dwyer has been found guilty of the murder of Elaine O'Hara in August 2012. The jury of 7 men and 5 women took just over 7.5 hours to find Dwyer guilty in a unanimous decision.
Elaine's father, Frank, issued a final statement at the end of the court proceedings. Quote, it was heartbreaking for us to listen to texts Elaine received from a depraved and diseased mind. The manipulation of her vulnerability was apparent, and when she tried to resist, she was reined back in. We can hear her voice in those texts, just wanting to be loved. We will probably never know what happened in Killikee on Wednesday the 22nd of August 2012, but there are questions that trouble us. When did Elaine realise it was not a game anymore? When did she realise the intention was to kill her for real? Did she try to run? And was she restrained? Did she suffer much? Could she and did she cry out? Was she left on the mountain to die alone? This is our life sentence. For us, there is no parole. After Elaine's death, her dad accepted her BA degree in education. After all the hard work that she put into achieving this, and all of the obstacles Elaine had to overcome, to accept that degree for his daughter was one of the proudest, albeit sombre moments of Frank's life. That's a pretty horrific case. They're all horrific, but I just think that book does such a good job of really building up a picture of who Elaine was and the incredible investigation that went on behind the scenes to eventually convict Graham. I did read as well in one of the articles that he's been appealing, but all of his appeals have been denied, thankfully. That's all for today's episode. Thank you so much for watching. I have a book recommendation. I don't have the book with me because I lent it to my friend because it's that good. I did an interview with an author called Amy Tintera, who is a New York Times best-selling author. She does sort of young adult novels, and she recently debuted her first adult novel, and it's brilliant. It's one of my favourite books I've read. It's really up my street. It's a thriller. It's out on March 14th, so I think it might be out. What is the date today? Oh, it's out today. This won't be today for you. It'll be out a couple of days ago. It's called Listen for the Lie, and it's about a true crime podcaster who wants to create a podcast about this woman who her best friend was murdered, and there is suspicion around her being the person who murdered her best friend, but she can't remember. And it's just a brilliant book. I did this interview with Amy, and I'll put a link in the description box below because it's on the podcast channel, so I will link that if you'd like to listen to it. Highly recommend. It's brilliant. I'll put a picture somewhere here so you can see what it looks like. It has a US cover and a UK cover, so if you're looking in your country, maybe I'll pop both here. Editing. Other than that, thanks so much for joining me today. I'm feeling so much better. Thank you so much for the well wishes from the last 2 videos. It was just a cold and I'm a wimp, so I made a really big deal out of it, but I'm feeling so much better. Glad to be back to my normal self. And I've had some amazing case suggestions over the last 2 weeks and added them to my list. and I'm getting on with those over the following week. So if you have any more case suggestions, do drop a comment down below. Other than that, thank you for watching, or if you're podcasting, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week for another episode of Red Rum. Bye. Oh, this is a side note. I started a baking company. What? It's called Thick Bakes, THICC Bakes. I'll put our Instagram in the description box below. We start selling, I say we, it's me and my sisters. It's very wholesome. We start selling on the 1st of April. So if you're UK based, go check us out. It's cookies. It's my favourite thing. I spent about 4 months trying to perfect the perfect cookie recipe, started giving them to my friends, and then people wanted to buy them. So I've set us up as a company. We're getting hygiene rated. We're getting food safety, all of the stuff in place, so I can start selling cookies and alongside writing Red Rums, and it's just going to be a dreamy life. I'm very lucky. I know I'm very, very lucky. Very lucky. Anyway, wow, this has become a diary. Apparently I'm a blogger too. Vlogger. Oh my god, I don't think I can put this in. If you got to this part, I've gone mad. Anyway, see you soon. Bye.